Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Affinity's COVID-19 webinar series. I would like to begin by respectfully acknowledging the Gadigal of the Eora Nation, the traditional owners and custodians of this land. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and to all their descendants who have cared for this place since creation. We also honour all other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who are joining us today. My name is Walingari Kandawara. I am an elder of the Aranda and Lurija Nations of Central Australia. I am also a Sydney-based artist, educator and performer. During my early childhood, I was fortunate to have a loving and caring, supportive family, but was made a ward of the state at 7 years of age. I was determined to get a university education and to use that education to help my people. My role now is to inform non-Aboriginal people about the beauty and relevance of my Aboriginal culture and to break down barriers and facilitate dialogue. I am also a member of Affinity's Advisory Board. Tonight's webinar is in recognition of World Children's Day. Our children are our future, and we must do whatever is possible to give our next generation the tools with which they can enter this world with confidence and ease. This generation will be leaving our children a world that is in turmoil and a future that is uncertain. Our children deserve better, and we owe it to them to make sure that we leave this planet in a better shape than what we have inherited. We live for our children, and our future is intrinsically linked with theirs. This episode is in collaboration with Australia for UNHCR and Amnesty International Australia. Like Affinity, these distinguished organisations promote community harmony, human rights, social cohesion and peace. Without further ado, I would now like to introduce tonight's facilitator, Lissa McMillan. Lissa has 30 years experience in the media, having worked on commercial radio, newspapers, the ABC and SBS. She was a senior executive since 1987, managing radio newsrooms and the ABC News Radio in Canberra, Melbourne and Sydney. She worked as radio editor for SBS Radio and planning editor for SBS TV, radio and online. She retired in 2015 to concentrate on windsurfing, sailing and learning languages. Lissa is also a very valuable member of Affinity's Advisory Board. Welcome, Lissa.
Thank you, Uncle Walingari, for your warm introduction. Tonight we will be discussing World Children's Day, Educate a Child. We've come together tonight for World Children's Day to share how we support refugee children who make up more than half of the world's refugee population of 79.5 million. UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, provides life-saving support for refugee children, including unaccompanied children separated from their families, as well as delivering educational opportunities and quality teaching and learning. The objective is that children have access to school programs in the first 3 months of displacement, forming foundations for young refugees to thrive now and into the future. Trudi Mitchell is the Deputy National Director of Australia for UNHCR and a passionate advocate for refugees with a deep understanding of issues affecting displaced people and children. She has met with children and families forced to flee violent gangs operating in the north of Central America, and has seen firsthand how UNHCR programs kept children safe from violence and exploitation, and assisted families to apply for asylum and to find work. Trudi has travelled to Uganda's Nakivale and Chakatu refugee settlements, where she met young refugees from Burundi, DRC, and Rwanda to inform plans for a new vocational training centre at Chakatu, funded by Australia for UNHCR. Also currently joining us live from Malaysia, we welcome Zarina Azmin, who is UNHCR's Malaysia's Head of Education as of 2016. Mimi joined UNHCR in 2008 after more than 11 years in the private sector, and she currently leads a team that focuses on advocacy, coordination, provision of support, and targeted actions aimed at enabling access to education for refugee children and youth in Malaysia, from early childhood to tertiary education. With the support of the Education Above All Foundation, founded by Her Highness Sheikha Motsu bint Nasser of Qatar, and its Educate a Child project, since 2012, UNHCR Malaysia has worked with more than 30 partners and the refugee community themselves in enabling access to education to some 14,000 refugee children and youth. And finally joining tonight is Dr. Thom, who has been Amnesty International Australia's refugee coordinator since the year 2000, working on behalf of individual asylum seekers, as well as on broader human rights issues relating to refugees. Dr. Thom has been a board member of the New South Wales Asylum Seeker Centre for the past 10 years. He's worked with urban refugees and visited refugee camps and detention centres in India, Thailand, Indonesia, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Malaysia, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, Kenya, the Netherlands, PNG, Nauru, and Australia. He publishes and lectures on domestic and international refugee issues and has represented Amnesty International at UNHCR's annual NGO consultations and the annual tripartite consultations on resettlement in Geneva for the past 13 years. He completed his doctoral thesis on post-war migration at the University of Sydney in 2000. Welcome, Trudi Mitchell, Zarina Azmin, and Dr. Thom. I'd like to start by... Good to see you all. I'd like to start by asking you all to share and reflect on the importance of today's World Children's Day to you. Trudi, if you'd like to begin.
Well, I think a good society helps children, doesn't it? And in the work that we do with refugees, we know that they are the most vulnerable, and giving them an education is a human right that not all of them do get. So, yeah, it's a priority.
Thanks, Trudi. Mimi, your thoughts on the day?
Well, children is our future. So if we do not provide for them all the basic needs and necessary access to everything that they need, such as education, health, that means we don't care about our future. So that's the importance of World Children's Day to us.
Thanks. So Graham, do you have a different perspective at all, or the children of the future?
No, I mean, I'd like to support both those statements. I think, you know, one of the things that we get to see in our job are the way that families try and look after their children all around the world, and we get to appreciate in Australia the benefits that we have and the ability, you know, that we often take for granted to send our kids to school and get an education. And, you know, we tell our children here that they can be anything they want to be, and we actually believe it in countries like Australia because we know the opportunities they have. But when you travel the world and you see the lengths that families will go to try and educate their children in places like the camps I've seen in Cox's Bazar, or in Kenya, or, you know, in Syria, it's amazing that this is such an important I guess priority for families regardless of where they are, and I think that's why this day really is so important.
Well, can we look at that issue of accessing education in a refugee camp? Like, refugee camps are challenging enough, But how do refugee children access education in, say, a refugee camp?
Well, I
Graham,
think, I think it really depends on the camp and the situation. For me, 2020 has been a pretty tough year, I think, for everyone. But one of the highlights for me this year was in January when we were able to put out a press release to say that the Bangladeshi government had announced that it was offering schooling and skill training to Rohingya children after 2.5 years in that camp when, they had really, the Bangladeshi government was very generous, allowing hundreds and thousands of people to cross its border, but it didn't want to provide education because it thought that would meant people would want to stay and wouldn't want to go back home. And so held out for 2.5 years. They actually looked for kids who were going to local schools and forced children out of local schools. And so it took a lot of campaigning and a lot of work, a lot of advocacy from Amnesty and our partners to finally convince the Bangladeshi government that it actually had a moral and human rights duty to provide education. And so, we now have over 2,000 learning centres in those camps. We have nearly 200,000 children getting some education. Unfortunately, it's only primary education. And this is where there is a lot of problems, often in camps and even in urban environments. It's only primary children that get education, and it drops down to something like 2 in 10 secondary school refugee children are being able to access education. Finding teachers in camps is difficult. Getting the resources that UNHCR and others need to be able to provide the basic curriculum is really difficult in camps because often, the world has moved on from one crisis to the next. And so being able to resource those camps is very, very difficult. Urban refugees have their own challenges, and I'm sure we'll be talking about that. And I'm sure Mimi has some important insights into that in Malaysia. But certainly in camps, because they are so confined, you sort of know where the kids are, but it's getting the teaching, getting the resources to those camps that's the real challenge.
So what are the differences then? Sorry, please, Trudi, go on.
Well, UNHCR conducted some research into this, and at the moment they're saying that 48% of school-age refugee children are out of school. And as Graham was saying, a lot of children are in primary school, but high school is a whole different matter. And with the pandemic this year, I think that we're seeing that impacting those numbers even more with access to schooling and those refugee children sort of slipping behind.
I was going to ask
Mimi, it's the same.
If you could explain maybe the difference between the urban setting and the camps. Is there a big difference for kids in those situations? Refugee children
in urban setting. So in urban setting, the refugees find accommodation wherever they can find, and they live side by side with the local community as well as other migrant population. As Graham mentioned, in a camp setting, you pretty much know where they are, but the challenge is getting resources, including teachers. For the urban setting, monitoring out-of-school children by far is our largest challenge. The children can be in school today and suddenly not in school tomorrow, mainly because of the dynamic nature of the population, and parents tend to move where economic opportunities and job opportunities are, and the locations where they move to may not have any access to education that is possible for the refugee children. And this is where also just to touch about the Malaysian setting. While there are many countries that are hosting refugees at the moment that have not ratified the Refugee Convention, but they are obligated under the Convention on the Rights of the Child to provide access and to include refugee children into the national education system. But Malaysia is unique in the sense that while they have ratified the CRC, they also have a specific reservation on Article 28, Paragraph A of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which pertains to the universal access to education. So while we have, when you look at the population figure, it's not as grand as some locations, especially Middle East like Lebanon or Jordan, but access to education is very much a challenge for refugee children in Malaysia. And in the lack of inclusion into the national system, while UNHCR is not supposed to be in service provision, we have had no choice but to work with other actors to mitigate this by having some informal education system in place. So having said that, it's something that requires a lot of resources. So getting children in school, looking at out-of-school children is always a challenge.
And how many schools or learning centres are you working with in Malaysia?
At the moment, we only have some 134 learning centres, and it's scattered all over Peninsular Malaysia.
Okay.
And that's just not enough.
Yeah. And how many refugee children do you think you have in the country?
Currently, at the moment, we have, out of 178,000 registered with UNHCR Malaysia, some 45,600 are children under the age of 18. So that's about 26%. So of school-going age, we have about 36,600.
Okay.
So you can imagine 36,600, only 14,000 in school.
Trudi, if I could turn to you for a moment, just to talk a bit to us, explain about some of UNHCR for Australia's work in supporting refugee children.
Right. Well, we work with our Australian donors to fund a whole range of programs. In emergencies, it would be the shelter, food support, protection, registration of refugees and refugee children. And for unaccompanied children, it's also family tracing and helping to fund reunification where possible. From an education point of view, Australia for UNHCR has been focused on education for a very long time, and that's from building primary schools, high schools, computer centres, particularly in the Nakavali refugee camp. That there was the first computer centre that we built some while ago now. And also vocational training centres, because one of the other issues is, and when I've been to Uganda, for instance, and to the Chakatu camp to set that settlement, there's 100,000 people there. There's a lot of young people, and they might get to high school if they're lucky at 15, but then their employment pathways and what they do next just wasn't clear. So Australia for UNHCR has built a vocational training centre there in Chakatu, and it provides things like hairdressing, agricultural learnings around agriculture, mechanics, computer services, catering, that sort of thing. And we had our first graduates this year. It's very exciting to see that those kids are moving on and having employment. And I guess my experience is I went there a couple of years ago when we were building it, and some of those children that I spoke to, I sort of said, well, what are you going to do now if there's not a vocational training centre? And they were saying, well, we'll just go home and we'll tend the garden or the vegetable patch. And that was it, So we're sort of looking at that longer term impact that we can have by helping people.
Sounds incredibly practical. And otherwise you'll have, I don't know, multiple lost generations, I would presume. So it's nothing to do.
Yeah. And I think displacement, when we're talking about displacement, on average it's 20 years. So that means that a lot of these children will never go back to their home. So it is really vital that the work that we're doing on educating children.
And what are the dangers as well for facing children in the times of displacement? It's not just. Can you talk a bit more about that whole concept of being displaced?
Yeah, I guess my experience in Central America, it's seen as the Northern Triangle, so Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. I went with Tim Elliott and Kate Geraghty from the Sydney Morning Herald, and our aim was just to shine a light on what is a silent emergency, really. And I was able to see firsthand just the impact that sort of the people having to flee because of violence, because of corruption, their personal safety, and seeing young children. I actually witnessed 3 young boys going across the Guatemala-Mexico border on their own and fleeing there. And it was really clear that they're very vulnerable. They're open to extortion, to trafficking, to sexual violence. I went to a shelter in Guatemala City, and this is a shelter where these children are being hunted down by gangs who want to recruit them. So often the boys are being recruited into gangs. And the young girl, I met a young girl who was 13, and she had a 1-year-old baby from a gang member. So it's quite an incredible situation to witness personally. But the positive side of it was what UNHCR and its partners were trying to do to help these people. Clearly underfunded, but helping with shelter, helping with that security for these children. There were 24 children there who had, quite severe psychosocial issues and trauma, providing counselling for them, health services. And also, if we come back to education, providing some educational opportunities within the shelter. So just trying to also give them a sense of normality. So I guess that's a reflection, Lissa, of what can happen when we don't protect children and those that are most vulnerable.
Absolutely. Graham, you've been with Amnesty International for 20 years and a board member of the New South Wales Asylum Seeker Centre for the past 10. Could you tell us a bit about your projects and the experiences that have impacted you the most?
Yeah, I mean, it's really been arranged during that time. I guess where Amnesty's strength is really is in its membership and its ability to advocate certain situations on behalf of certain groups. And the example I gave earlier around the Rohingya and trying to get schooling in those camps, was one of the, I guess, more interesting things that we were able to do, because we weren't alone. We were in partnership with others, and we were able to bring some high-profile Bangladeshi artists into the camp on World Refugee Day last year. We were able to spend a few days with the children, getting them to just draw and highlight what they wanted to be, what their future was, work with the artists and draw pictures of being doctors or nurses or pilots or those sorts of things. And then we were able to take that artwork, with UNICEF and display it in Dhaka to highlight, the aspirations of these children. We were able to take it to Washington, DC, to London, to capital cities around the world as part of our advocacy. We then set up a petition to try and put pressure on the government. We were able to work with a couple of YouTube stars, Bangladeshi YouTube stars, who developed their own hip-hop song based around the wording of the petition, again, trying to highlight the situation and put pressure on the Bangladeshi government. And with that, that's sort of the creative things we do. I have sort of here the actual, we then write reports which highlights specifically the human rights situation. You know, this is where Amnesty has a benefit that other organisations don't have. If you want to work in camps, you often have to toe the government line. And if you criticise the government, you risk your funding, you risk getting expelled from camps. And this is where the independence of Amnesty is really important. And we can come in and then we can say the things that maybe those governments don't want to hear or don't want to be told. But it does enable others to come in behind us. It enables governments like the Australian government, who's generously provided millions of dollars to support education programs through partners in places like Cox's Bazar, you know, to have that evidence that they need to do that. I mean, personally, one of the most, I guess, challenging but rewarding things I did was travel to Syria. This was before the conflict, and we were looking at refugees fleeing out of Iraq at that time into Syria, and Palestinian refugees were being stuck at the border. The Syrians were allowing Iraqis to cross, but if you were Iraqi Palestinian, sorry, not at all. And I mean, the situation was so dire that some had got through, and there was, you know, the Syrians had their own Palestinian population. This was why they were blocking others. But those that got through had started going to the local school with the other Palestinian kids. And it got to the point where the Syrian authorities came to the school, rounded up the children who had come across the border, put them in buses and said to the school, you call up the parents and say if they want to see their kids again, they come to the school. And the parents, of course, showed up, and they were all transported to these refugee camps along the border. And so one of the things that Amnesty did, again with a number of other organisations, was to go to those camps with UNHCR. You know, UNHCR facilitated this trip, and they took us to these camps. We were able to see firsthand what was going on. We were able to come back to the Australian government, the Canadian government, the US government, Dutch government, and say, look, you resettle these guys out of the camps, and the Syrians then will be able to deal with those that got through. You know, they promised that they wouldn't round up any more kids at the school, that they would allow those there to stay. And, you know, through that evidence, we were able to get a coalition of resettlement governments, and we were able to empty those camps, which was lucky because, as we know, a few years later, these are the areas that were then overrun by ISIS, and it would have been an absolute bloodbath had they still been in those camps. So, you know, this is where advocacy plays a really important role in supporting the work of UNHCR and others who are on the ground providing the direct assistance to the refugee children and families.
Wow, very powerful story, and great to hear the teamwork of the group that we've got here together, making such a difference. I think we just want to take a break now and hear a short message, a World Children's Day message from the Amity College Illawarra campus high school girls.
On the 20th of November, people from all walks of life will come together to celebrate an incredibly special day, acknowledging the rights of children. It is important that children's rights are recognised and accepted because this is an investment in the future. We should be able to grow and flourish, becoming tomorrow's guardian of the world we live in. Children have a mandated right to feel safe, to grow healthy, to be heard, and to be educated. This simple formula carries a powerful message of hope, peace, and prosperity.
They say education is emancipation. How unbelievably true those words are. Making children aware of who they are and the world they live in will help alleviate much of this world's problems. Educating children will have far-reaching effects, from reducing racism and fostering acceptance of one another to aiding in the elimination of child exploitation, which comes in many heinous forms. So on this wonderful day, please join us in listening to kids, cherishing them, accepting that they have a voice, recognizing that they deserve a say in their development, and making this planet a better place for everyone. Happy World Children's Day!
And thank you, Jana and Melissa. Mimi, most of the refugees in Malaysia are Rohingya from Myanmar. In many ways, they are the most vulnerable of the vulnerable. So can you tell us a bit about the challenges and opportunities there are in education for this community in particular? Mimi, if you just, I think you might be on mute.
I'm sorry.
You're good now.
Okay,
Go ahead, please.
Rohingya refugees make up the majority of the population registered with UNHCR in Malaysia. So we're talking about more than 100,000. They have the highest number of out-of-school children. And this is where you see the impact of that protracted situation where generations after generations have been denied access to education. Because education is not just about learning what's in the books. It's not just that. It's going to school, interacting with peers, understanding the needs for rules, listening to teachers, voice of authority in that sense, learning discipline, analytical skill, critical thinking. So when generations have been denied that, even when they flee and they're in asylum and seeking refuge, often they're not able to really come together and cohesively support themselves without the assistance of others. So in trying to build a community of refugees that's resilient, self-reliant, education is so important. And this is where the opportunities are for the Rohingya population. Education is also something that you don't see the results or impact in a year or two. Often it takes a long time to see substantial change. And with the Rohingya communities, I think after all these years of us going to them and say, listen, your children need to school, they must gain some sort of education, even at the most basic literacy, numeracy skills. They're now appreciating education, and you start to see changes and impact in not just the children population, but also among the adults. The challenge for this population also, when the adults are largely illiterate, finding community members, community teachers is also a challenge. So this is why the majority of them in Malaysia, the teachers, we hire local teachers, and they are using the local national curriculum and syllabus. Something that is also unique to the Rohingya population, they don't have a written form of their language. It's only verbal. So, in terms of teaching them, it's the introduction of other scripts, but they are amazing. They catch languages quickly, maybe because they learn it audio. So within 2 or 3 months of arriving in Malaysia, often they are already able to speak basic Bahasa. So they've got skills that is innate to them that you will not find with other populations.
Just on the language question, so you've got a population who are coming, they haven't got a written language, but they've got a verbal language. Where do you go with what language to teach them? Is it their own language, the language of the country they're in, the language they might be resettled to? What's the decision-making process for languages? And please, any of the panel, please jump in on this one, because...
Yeah, so for us, because we're not able to use their own mother tongue, and largely the teachers are from the local population, so often we use Bahasa Malaysia. But there's also for them to choose if they would prefer to go to learning centers where English is the language of instruction. English is stressed upon at the learning centers, mainly because it's the most common language. So this is something that will hold them in good stead, whether they remain in Malaysia, whether they're resettled to other countries, or whether they, if ever at one point, to go back home to help with post-conflict nation building. This is because when you look at other populations as well, when conflict ends and a country is trying to build itself, this is where development actors come into the picture. and foreign direct investments. And obviously English is a key language. So that's why at school here, the two languages are Bahasa Malaysia and English for the Rohingyas.
Okay, Trudi, what experiences have you had with that question? What to teach the children in the camps or in the urban areas?
That's sorry, I missed that. And can you hear me now? I'm just having a bit of trouble with my. Yeah. So sorry, could you repeat that, Lissa?
We were talking about the forms of education and particularly what language might you teach refugee children, because should they be learning the language of the area that they're being refugees in at the time, or a language that they might use in a place they're resettled to, or when they go back home? What sort of choices are there in those sorts of really fundamental questions of what language would we teach these kids?
I'm thinking that Mimi might have more sort of knowledge around this than I do practically, but I would think that learning the country that you're in and learning English would be a very big advantage.
Thanks. And Graham, did you have you've been working with this population as well, particularly the Rohingya population?
Yeah, I mean, it really does depend because, as Trudi pointed out earlier, refugees are now having to spend many, many years in whichever country, that they arrive in. And so the ability to learn the local language is really important, but it really varies. And this is where there is no consistency at all, because if you are able to go to the local schools, sometimes that's really problematic. Like we were meeting with Chin refugees in Delhi, for instance, and they were quite reluctant to send their kids to local schools because they say, why do we want our kids to learn this language? The Indian government has made it very clear we will never, ever be allowed to stay here. And, we're likely to be resettled. Why wouldn't we be at a school where we can learn English? This is pointless. It's just pointless. Whereas for other kids, particularly in as Trudi pointed out, in Latin America, or kids going to school in the Middle East, going to a local school is really beneficial. It's in your language. You're likely to be staying in that country for some time. So, that the ability to go to a local school becomes really important. Indonesia's been a really tricky one as well. And so, you now have a fabulous learning centre there, the Chisawa Learning Centre, that was set up so kids could learn in their own language. Because again, the families there felt they were never going to be allowed to stay in Indonesia. Indonesia's made it very clear they will never be allowed to stay. So what's the point of them learning Indonesian when they're constantly told you are going to have to go one day? So they would prefer to learn in their own language, or they would prefer to learn English. And so the ability for UNHCR to set up and work with learning centres is really important for those kids. So it does often depend on the population and where they are and which countries, but it does make it very complex. And I mean, Malaysia is a classic example where kids can't go to the local school, even though for the Rohingya, many of the Rohingya, Malaysia is the country they want to stay in. They're quite happy to be there and they would love to learn the local language. So it's such a shame that that's a country where they can't go to a local school. But it's a real challenge for UNHCR and for the governments themselves.
Indeed. And just to add to that about language, may I?
Yes, please.
Like, for example, the Rohingya refugees, they got so used to Bahasa Malaysia, and we have former students who have been resettled to the US, for example. And when they communicate with us and their former teachers here, they're still using Bahasa. And even among themselves, because they went to school together and was learning in Bahasa together, they would speak in Bahasa. So in a way, they're the ones who are spreading and increasing the usage of Bahasa Malaysia worldwide. So,
yes, an unexpected
right.
outcome. Absolutely.
They're speaking better than me.
We mentioned before that it's mainly the primary age children who are able to access any form of education. So I was wondering if we could talk a bit more and opening it up to the group of the challenges faced by the youth, the refugee youth trying to access further education and increasingly as they get older, and what indeed can be done about that. Trudy, would you like to kick off on that? Oh, Graham, go for it.
You go, Graham.
First on the buzzer goes.
Yeah, I mean, this really is a serious challenge, and I think, we've already heard some of the issues there. If you're in a refugee camp and you're a young man, for instance, and you have no access to education, what do you do? Where do you go? And when, for instance, a few years ago with the Andaman Sea crisis, and we were in Aceh and meeting with the Rohingya again who were rescued off those boats, a number of the young men we met got on the boats because they wanted to be able to get an education, and they knew it was never going to happen in the camps, or it was not going to happen in Myanmar. And so this is one way they saw of getting a future, but it meant they put their lives at risk. And we know that, again, we've heard about the exploitation and abuse that they are, putting themselves in harm's way when they do this. And also, I mean, it's when we talk about education, one of the things that's really important to talk about is the gendered aspect of education and the way young girls are able to access education. And I think it's when we get to secondary school, that's when we see even more issues facing young girls, and the need to actually put in particular measures to ensure that young girls can access a further education, because if they can't, then one of the survival mechanisms for those young girls is to be married off. And so we see a lot of young teenage brides because, the family is trying to find a way to protect their daughters, and this is marrying them off is the only really option they have if they can't get them into education. It becomes so important, again, when we want to avoid exploitation of young people, both boys and girls. But, girls face a really specific challenge if they can't get into education.
Indeed. And I wanted to ask about ensuring some sort of equal access for girls and boys. But if we could maybe if Trudi or Mimi wanted to talk a bit more about the access to youth, and then we can talk a bit more about the girls and boys issue as well.
The thing about access to youth is that if the foundation is not there at the primary level, then educating youth is going to be an even bigger challenge. And this is where we are so thankful for funders, donors such as Education Above All and the Educate a Child project. While they are focused only on the primary education, the funding they provide, they hope that they will be able to provide a robust that will enable the children to then academic progression to the secondary level. And this is where the call is for other actors and donors to come in and collectively look at the access to secondary education. Like in Malaysia, for example, some of the partners offer, recognizing the fact that, like for the Rohingya population, they have gaps in their education lifespan. So children, when they get to the secondary level, it's best to be realistic. So they're assessed to see if they are academically inclined or they're not. And fully recognizing the fact that if they're not, it's no fault of theirs, but the circumstances that have brought them to where they are. Then the responsibility is also to make sure that the program available is not just in the books, but also in providing them with important life skills and vocational training, because the whole idea is later they'll be able to be self-reliant and independent. So there's
Indeed, and
plenty
Trudi
of
was
opportunities. Yeah.
more on the vocational issues before, the access to the older individuals. And have you got, if you'd like to expand on that, or turn to the issue for the equity of access for the girls and the boys?
So in terms of girls and boys, at the moment, the parity at the primary level in Malaysia is okay, pretty much equal between boys and girls. And like Graham mentioned, it's when they go to secondary education, you will see, especially for a population like the Rohingya, which can be very conservative, then girls are expected to either stay at home to care for younger siblings, or worse, they are forced into minor marriage. And to them, it's a cultural practice that protects the girls and also increase the number of breadwinner in the family. With time, though, and communication with the community, outreach efforts, awareness, also sometimes a little bit of arm twisting, we see that more girls are in school. And sometimes talking to communities especially conservative communities, where how would you feel if your wife will have to be treated by a male doctor, for example? And then it gets them to thinking like, oh, wait a second, I wouldn't like that. But how would you have female doctors then without education? So then it starts that conversation going, and you need to put it in realistic issues like that in front of them for them to really think. And I'm really, really happy to report that we have seen an increase in the number of girls in school. Actually, the success stories that we have from the settlement countries are from girls. Two of our star stories are of Rohingya girls who completed primary education here and soon after were resettled. And they wrote back and they were able to assimilate and get into classes that's comparative to their age. So these two girls recently graduated, and they respectively got scholarships to study medicine and nursing. So they wrote back saying thank you, and the parents now see the impact of it. And I think being in that sort of society and setting, they fully realize the importance of education. So we're also working with these STAR students to hopefully reach out to more community and convince them that girls in school is truly important.
And Trudi, have you got an addition to that?
Sorry, Lisa. I think that's a really great point, Mimi. It's about, if you don't see it, how do you know that that's what you can do? So it's having those role models coming and seeing that it is possible, and seeing, and I think that's a broader diversity sort of conversation as well, but that's really important.
And I just want to point out to the audience at home, there's an opportunity coming up to ask questions to this talented panel. So if you've got a question, please send it through via YouTube or Facebook. And at this very juncture, I think we should have a listen to a short choir performance. Again, Amity College Girls High School. This is the Preston's campus.
Do you remember who was when you first started?
Go girls. Thank you, Andy.
Yay.
Haven't heard that one for a while. Now, we have had a question from the audience. It's a very current question. It's COVID-19. We have COVID-19. We've got border closures, limitations and barriers for a safe path for migrants and refugees, including those with children. So how can we continue to assist the most vulnerable in our region during a time of a global pandemic? Maybe Graham, if you could kick us off.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important question because resettlement has stopped. And sadly, Australia cut back its resettlement program in the last budget, but New Zealand has increased its program. Canada's going to increase its program. The US, with the election, President-elect Biden has said that he'll increase the program, which can have a really important impact in the region and is a great way to leverage other solutions for people in the past. And UNHCR's ability to convince governments to allow education and other programs is often dependent on support from resettlement countries. When that's not happening and people are trapped and they're stuck, it creates all sorts of new challenges. And Malaysia, I mean, my hat's off to the entire crew that's working there, because sadly, what we've seen with COVID, particularly in this region, is a rise in xenophobia. Really, the other is being accused of transmitting the disease, spreading the disease, beyond all reason and sanity. Facts don't seem to matter at all in this debate. And where we were seeing progress in terms of the rights of refugees and asylum seekers and others in this region, that has just gone backwards at a rate of knots, unfortunately, thanks to COVID and the rise of xenophobia and the way, again, certain politicians have exploited this moment in time to actually progress some pretty horrific agendas. And we saw that once again when we had boats, Rohingya boats, drifting in the Andaman Sea, and governments who said after the last crisis 5 years ago, never again, suddenly were pushing boats back out to sea and saying, no, not under COVID, we can't risk it. And it was again, thanks to Achinese fishermen and their generosity and their willingness to go above and beyond their government and other governments in the region to say, no, these are humans and we'll rescue them, that we actually saw people saved who had been at sea for months. So, it's been pretty dire, sadly, in this region and other regions around the world, but it's going to create a lot of work for people going forward to try and re-establish some of the initiatives that we had set in place to support refugees prior to the COVID crisis.
And Trudi, what complications are you seeing with COVID?
I think we're seeing some of the positives around how communities in Africa, for instance, or refugee settlements in Africa are managing the virus. In Cox's Bazar, we've just had a project around a livelihood project and around women making face masks for the local community as well as for the Rohingya refugees, and the work that they do as a community within the settlements to make sure that everybody's safe and educate each other. So I guess there are a couple of practical things that we're seeing that are positive, but I guess we're all in this together, and these refugee settlements and the most vulnerable people in the world need to be protected and looked after just as all the rest of us are.
And Mimi, are there any particular issues that COVID has brought up in your environment? And you're on mute again, Mimi. No, we can't hear you, Mimi. You're on mute, I think.
You might want to refresh.
Yes, haven't refreshed Mimi. Meanwhile, speaking of this, I'll move on to a technology question because I think that's quite apt. Is there a role that technology can play in helping refugee children access an education? Trudi, would you like to speak to that?
I think definitely, and I think there's through technology there's huge accessibility for refugees, and we'll be able to use such untapped resources through technology. I'm trying to. I'm sort of trying to think of a situation using technology. I might have to come back to you on that. Sorry.
No worries. Graham, have you got an example?
Are you right, Mimi?
No, still can't hear Mimi. Graham, have you got
Yeah, look, I think remote learning has been really important and really crucial. And what we have seen is again, through UNHCR, but a number of universities, including Australian universities, really stepping up to the plate and offering that further education to refugee communities and offering scholarships through further education. So refugees, both in urban environments but also in camps, are able to access higher education through remote learning. And the ability to be able to do things like we're doing tonight has made such a difference, really, because a lot of universities now have set up courses that people can do remotely. And so it has provided a pathway that we really haven't seen before. And, again, COVID, I think, has spurred that along in some respects. And so the resources that are available now are quite extraordinary. And technology is something that refugees are really, ahead of the game in a lot of respects. The use of mobile phones to stay in touch, to be able to work out, where family are, where to get support, where to get help, is something that they've been able to utilise for many, many years now. And this has only really aided them in ways that I think a lot of us couldn't even imagine a few years ago, in terms of being able to access education. It's been crucial. We've seen that in camps in Bangladesh, for instance, how they access English language training, and their ability to find tutors is quite extraordinary. And, they would sell their rice rations to be able to get money to pay for tutors. Now they can do that through their mobile devices. So it's been really, really beneficial, I think, and technology will only take us further when it comes to education, I think, in the future.
Yes, and I think the point is well made that the disaster of the COVID-19 has led us to accelerate incredibly the use of technology, as we are doing tonight. And there may be that silver lining that helps in that way in delivering services and educational services to refugees. Mimi, are you with us now?
Can you hear me, or you still cannot?
I can hear you. No, I can hear you. You sound wonderful.
It's very good.
Great. Okay.
Did you? The hour has flown, and we are actually at the end of the period. But if you just would like to add thoughts on COVID and technology, which is what we've been just discussing while you've been unable to speak, we'd love to hear from you.
Well, Graham mentioned about how COVID-19 has brought the worst out in the Malaysia setting. True, but also it brought out the best among the civil society and the public. While the government has imposed certain things and which has negatively impacted not just the refugee population, but the migrants as well. The locals have come together, provided support whenever they can, and the sentiment have been almost like half-half. In terms of education, where there's a challenge like this, there's also opportunity, where we have had challenges in terms of resources in the past in trying to streamline things and provide some sort of uniformity in terms of education that is being accessed by the refugee children. With COVID-19 and the introduction of technology using tablets, connected learning, we were able to share videos online and all these learning materials that in many ways provide more uniformity to what they're learning. Because there's always disparity in terms of the quality of teaching, like among local teachers with the right qualification versus community teachers who may not come from the right background. So there's opportunities as well as challenges. And I think what's important for us is to stay positive and to work with what we have and hope that 2021 will be a much kinder.
Yes, a very positive way on which to end our fascinating discussion. Thank you very much for your time, Trudi Mitchell, Mimi, Zarina, Azmin, and Dr. Graham Thom. And to end the night, I'd like to call upon Affinity's Executive Director, Amit Polat, to present the concluding remarks.
Thank you, Cousin Lissa. Good evening, distinguished viewers, my newly extended families, uncles, cousins, aunties, and new viewers. Tonight, Affinity is proud of presenting the World Children's Day webinar as a manifestation of its commitment to international peace and universal human rights. I'd like to thank our supporting partners, Australia for UNHCR and Amnesty International for their efforts, not only tonight, but by welcoming, supporting, and aiding refugees of all ages from all around the world. I want to also acknowledge UNHCR Malaysia for its efforts to welcome and support refugees. I'd like to sincerely thank our inspiring speakers for their active engagement and dedication to children and our future. Trudi, Mimi, and Cousin Graham. Thank you, Cousin Lissa, for facilitating this significant webinar. Thank you to our young voices from Amity College and my esteemed uncle Walingari for the warm welcome. Finally, a big thanks for Lee, Matt, and Matthew for their contributions in the running of this webinar. Unfortunately, humanity is witnessing the suffering of millions of children together with their families, from Syria to Yemen, from Turkey to Sudan, from Libya to Congo, and from Somalia to Myanmar and other countries of the world. These children have become the victims of wars, conflicts, politics, and have been oppressed in not only prisons, but in the countries they call home. On the occasion of this day, I invite everybody to contribute to the efforts of governmental, civil society, and international organizations that are working to rescue children from physical, emotional, and other forms of abuse within the framework of universal human values, and to be with them always through their prayers. I hope in the near future, we will be able to provide a righteous and peaceful world where every child can live with dignity and tranquility with their families. We should lift up and provide a genuine great gift of freedom, education, and rights, and deliver it safely to the future generations. The future of countries depends on its children, and education is the key for children's future. Distinguished viewers, to end the night, I would like to share with you Affinity's upcoming webinar. Violence against women and girls is one of the most widespread and devastating human rights violations in our world today. In hopes of raising awareness and making a change, Affinity, UNAA New South Wales, and the Law Council of Australia will be presenting a webinar on the International Day for Elimination of Violence Against Women on 25th November. The Honorable Tanya Plibersek, MP, Pauline Wright, and Tasnim Chopra, OAM, will be in conversation with Jamal Wells. Thank you to our listeners from home and our speakers, Lissa, Trudi, Mimi, Cousin Graham, and supporters. I look forward to seeing you next week, Wednesday, at 7 p.m. Have a lovely weekend. Thank you.